So we're going to get started creating some content, taking a look at how to navigate the 3D space inside the Unity game engine, and we'll start creating the first components of our gravity project. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a game object, and the game object is going to be a simple cube that we're going to use for the floor or the platform of our project. And the way that I'll do this is I'm going to go up to the Unity menu. From the game object menu, the game object menu allows me to create different kinds of game objects. And what I'm most interested in right now are the 3D objects. Now, inside the 3D object, game object submenu, we can create some very simple primitive 3D shapes. And I want to choose cube. Now, when I create a cube, you can see that I get a cube in the hierarchy, and I also get a cube in the center of my viewport. And you should be seeing the cube popping up with the 3 direction axes, okay? And if not, that may mean that you might have selected one of these tools over here. So in the top left-hand corner, make sure that you're using, by default, the Move tool, and then any object that you have selected in the hierarchy is going to show up in the scene view. Now, once we created the cube, I want to draw your attention over to the inspector because there's a couple things that we want to be mindful of. This game object has a transform component. When I talk about a component, what I mean is that the section within the inspector that contains information for that component. So components are separated by these rules. Okay, so you can see there's a rule here. And if I look inside the inspector, I have a transform component. When the transform component ends, there's a cube mesh filter component, then we have a box collider component and a mesh render component, and so on. We can add and remove components to projects as needed, but I just wanted to point out that when we talk about a specific component, it's one of these items in here. So I'm looking at the cube and I'm looking at the transform component. The transform component is the place where we can numerically modify the object. So if I were to go into, say, the scale, and I want to change the scale of this object according to the X, the Y, or the Z, I can simply go in here and change a number, and I'll hit return. And now you can see that I've just scaled this object to 10 on its X axis. Okay, I'll set that scale back to 1 for a moment. Now, I can interact with the transform component. I can also click and drag this object around the scene. And you'll notice that if I roll my mouse over one axis, I can click and move and drag that object. No matter how sloppy my mouse is, okay, I'm restricting its motion just to one axis. As I move this around, pay attention to what's happening in the transform component. As I click and drag this around, you can see that the Z value of the position component is being updated based on dragging this around. Okay. Now, by default, when I create an object, its position is going to be at 0, 0, 0. 0, 0, 0 in this 3D world is the center of our game level. Okay. So whenever we create content, unless we have a compelling reason, we want to start at the center of our 3D space. Okay. Now, we have a position and a scale. We have a position, a rotation, and a scale, and I can modify the scale. There's different ways to modify the transform component. We saw that we can just highlight a value and change its number. So I can change its X position, okay? But I can also roll my mouse over the label of that value. So in this case, I'm rolling my mouse over position X, and when I do, you can see that I get a little left-right arrow. And if I click and drag while I'm over top of that element there, I can just slide my mouse back and forth, and you can see I can get this kind of intuitive way to nudge things around. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways that I can move content. I'm just going to zero this back out, hit 0 and hit return. So I have my cube back at the center of the world. So take a few minutes, play around with this object and kind of move it around and just see what's happening in the transform component. Maybe go to game objects and go to 3D objects and create another kind of game object like a sphere. Now you can see when I create the sphere, even though it's selected, I can't see it. It's because they're occupying the same space. So I'll just grab it by its vertical axis and move it up. Now you'll notice that these 3 axes correspond to this little widget here in the top right-hand corner. This is not an arbitrary arrangement. We have our y-axis. Our y is our up-down axis. Okay. We have our red axis, which is our x-axis, which is typically considered to be the left-right axis in our space. Now we're looking at this through a perspective view, so it's kind of moving in the foreground and background, currently our x. Same thing with our z. Our z is kind of moving a little bit in the foreground and in the background, and that just has to do with the perspective that our current viewport is in. Now if we want to navigate this scene, so in other words, I don't want to move these objects around, but I want to navigate my view relative to these objects. The way that I'll navigate is I'm going to use the mouse and keyboard in combination to move around this scene. The first thing I'm going to do is on a Mac, I'm going to hold down the Option key. On a PC, it's going to be the Alt key. I'm going to hold down the Option key and left click. And when I do, I'm going to move my mouse around, and what I'm doing is I'm orbiting my view. So I'm changing my perspective. Okay. Now, Option, click and drag, that will give us our ability to orbit and change our perspective. And as I orbit, pay attention to what's happening here to this widget in the top right-hand corner. So I hold down Option, click and drag. I'm changing my orientation or my view relative to the world space. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to orbit around and I'm going to look roughly down the z-axis. So I'm going to orbit until this blue axis is pointing more or less away from me. And you can see that the object axes also correspond, for now, with the world space. I'm just going to kind of point this in a way that the blue axis is more or less pointing away from me. Okay, so I'm more or less looking down the z-space. My y-axis is up and down. That's the Option, click and drag to orbit. Okay, now in addition to orbit, we can change our view a couple of different ways. We can pan. I'm going to hold down the Option and Command key. I believe on a PC it's Option Control, but you're going to have to tinker with this PC, folks. Option Command, and I'm going to left click. And now you'll notice that as I move this around, what I'm doing is I'm not orbiting, but I'm panning. I'm moving relative to the plane of view of my camera. So I'm holding down Option Command, and I'm sliding left and right, up and down. Okay, so Option, click and drag is orbit. Option, Command, click and drag is pan. And then I can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out. Okay, so those are the three different ways that we can orbit our view. Alternatively, what we can do is we can use a couple of these tools up here to modify these objects. But your best bet for now, just go back to the Move tool, make sure objects are selected. Again, your best bet is to use these quick key commands for now. So Option orbit, Option Command to pan, and mouse wheel to zoom in and out. So spend some time playing around with creating objects, moving them around, orbit, pan, zoom in and out of this space. And the next presentation will be a little bit more organized, a little bit more systematic in the way that we create content. We'll manage our content. We'll start to set up a simple game, a game scene, but we'll do that in the next presentation.